The day peace died, they came without sound. No warning, no message, no mercy. The skies of Illyria were calm just a moment ago. Birds flew over green forests. Children played near glowing rivers. Lyora stood in the Garden of Harmony, smiling. She wore a simple white robe. Her hair flowed like silver under the sunlight. She was not a queen, not a soldier, but everyone on the planet, and many across the stars, called her the voice of peace. She believed in talks, not war. She believed in listening before fighting. And she believed, always, that peace was stronger than any weapon. But today, peace was dying. A scream tore the air as fire rained from the sky. Alien ships, black and sharp like knives, appeared above the capital. They fired without stopping. Buildings fell. Trees burned. People ran. Lyora turned, her eyes wide. Her young son, Kale, just 9 years old, held her hand tightly. "Mother, what's happening?" he cried. Lyora pulled him close. "Stay with me," she said softly, her voice shaking but calm. Soldiers ran toward them, but they were not from Illyria. These were the Zartok, cruel aliens with metal skin, burning red eyes, and armor like stone. They had no interest in talks. They only knew conquest. One of them stepped forward. He was taller, with black horns on his helmet. This was Commander Varnak, known across galaxies for destroying peace talks by killing everyone at the table. He looked at Lyora and laughed. "You are the famous peacemaker. You wasted your life." Lyora stood tall. "You don't have to do this. We can speak. We can find a path without blood." Varnak raised his weapon. "We already found our path. Through fire." Kale tried to run toward the guards, but his mother stopped him. "Please," she said, her voice now like a whisper, "let my son live." Varnak nodded. "He will live, to remember what happens to those who dream of peace." He fired. The shot hit Lyora in the chest. She fell to the ground, eyes still open, looking at her son. No scream came from her lips, only silence. Kale fell to his knees. "Mother." The soldiers pulled him away as he kicked and screamed. But Lyora didn't move. The garden around her, once full of light, now burned with smoke and ash. They did not kill Kale. They left him with a scar on his face and in his heart. He was taken by a small group of survivors who hid in caves while the Zartok destroyed the cities. For days, Kale didn't speak. He just stared at the sky, where the alien ships still floated like shadows. He held a small crystal, a memory crystal, that had his mother's last speech recorded in it. He played it every night before sleeping. Peace is not weakness. Peace is a choice, a strength greater than war. But to Kale, those words now felt hollow. One night, he stood outside the cave. He looked up at the stars, the same stars his mother once told him held hope. "They killed her," he whispered. "They burned our world." A tear rolled down his cheek. He clenched his fists. He remembered the cold voice of Commander Varnak. He remembered his mother's body on the ground. He looked at the stars again. "I remember your face," he whispered. "And one day, you'll remember mine." Years later, people would speak of a boy who escaped the fire, a boy who lost peace and found something else in its place, a boy who would return, not with open hands, but with fire in his eyes. And they would say his name with both fear and hope, Kale. But on that day, the day peace died, he was just a broken child, holding a broken heart, watching a world fall. And deep inside him, something darker than grief was born. The boy who spoke to fire. Kale never forgot the smell of burning trees, or the way his mother's voice sounded just before the end. Soft, steady, unshaken by fear. But that voice was now gone, burned away like the gardens of Illyria. For 3 long years, Kale lived in the shadows of broken planets. He didn't smile. He didn't speak much. Not to the old miners who took him in, not to the traders who passed through the caves, not even to the stars. But fire lived inside him. Quiet fire. Not wild flames. Not yet. Just a slow burn, like coals under ash. Every night, he held the same crystal his mother had left behind. He played it again and again, even when he already knew every word. Peace is not weakness. Peace is a choice. You are my hope, Kale. He stared at the crystal in silence, his jaw tight. Then why did peace die? He asked the stars. The turning point. At age 13, Kale disappeared. He left in the middle of a cold night, with only a stolen cloak and a short blade. No one saw him for 4 years. Stories began to spread, of a boy surviving alone on dead moons, learning to speak alien tongues, trading secrets for weapons. Some said he had no name. Some called him the ghost of Ilaria. But the truth was stranger. Kale had joined smugglers, not for money, but for information. He learned how the Zartok worked, how their ships moved, how they communicated, how they ruled. He watched, he listened, and he hated. One day, the smugglers raided a fallen transport. In the wreckage, Kale found a metal box with a strange marking, a spiral sun, the symbol of the old Earth soldiers. Inside the box was a rusted datapad, old files, training logs, tactical maps. But more than anything, it held ideas. Strike when they sleep. One man with a plan is stronger than 100 with rage. War is not madness. War is math. Kale didn't sleep that night. He watched those old files over and over, learning how soldiers fought. He was quiet, but his mind was loud. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. The fire finds a voice. Years passed. Now he was 17. Taller, stronger, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, unreadable, dangerous. He wore old battle armor painted black. His blade had been replaced by an energy rifle, and on his belt hung the crystal, his mother's voice still near him. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. But wherever he went, fear followed. He first struck a Zartok fuel convoy on planet Transix. 3 transport ships, destroyed in minutes. No witnesses. Then came the outpost on Garn Station. 40 soldiers dead. Communications tower hacked. The words "Ilaria lives" burned into the wall. No one claimed the attacks. But whispers grew. Someone's fighting back. Someone human. The Zartok called him a terrorist. The miners called him a flame reborn. But to Kale, he was only a son with a promise. The mentor. On the frozen moon of Vestin, Kale met Rogan, a half-blind war veteran who once fought the Zartok before surrender was signed. Kale saved Rogan's life during a bar shootout. In return, Rogan trained him like a soldier. "You've got anger," Rogan said, "but war needs more than that. You want to win. Learn how to think like them." Kale trained with Rogan for months. Gunfire drills, explosive traps, infiltration techniques. And slowly, Kale spoke more. Not much, but enough. One night, Kale asked, "Why do you help me?" Rogan looked at the scar on Kale's cheek. "Because I see it in your eyes. The same look I had when they took my brother. You want to burn the world down." Kale nodded. "No, I want to burn one empire down." A memory replayed. Before his next mission, Kale sat alone and played the crystal again. "You are my hope, Kale, not my weapon." He stared at the glowing message, his jaw clenched. "Sorry, Mother," he whispered, "but hope doesn't stop monsters." He snapped the crystal shut, stood, and vanished into the night. The boy who spoke to fire, Kale, no longer ran from the Zartok. He hunted them. He didn't speak their language. He understood it. Their fears, their weakness, their pride. He became the shadow under their boots, the fire in their fuel lines, the whisper in their command rooms. He had no army, but he had purpose, and purpose burns hotter than revenge. Soon, his name would echo through the stars, a name the Zartok would come to fear, a name that was once whispered beside flowers and songs. Kale, son of peace, voice of war, one-man army. In the dark corners of space, where law no longer reached and stars blinked like dying candles, a name began to echo, not as a whisper, but as a warning. Kale. The boy had become something else now. He didn't wear uniforms. He didn't follow orders. He didn't belong to any planet, fleet, or flag. He was a soldier of one. But that was enough. A target marked by fire. The Zartok Empire had ruled the outer rings for over 100 years. Planets bowed before them. Species gave up without a fight. Resistance was rare and short-lived. But now, things were changing. Outposts were vanishing. Fuel depots were exploding. Communication towers went silent overnight. It wasn't an army doing this. It was one man, using the Empire's own pride against them. Kale studied their routines, intercepted their patrols, watched how they moved, how they thought. He became invisible in plain sight. He didn't attack for glory. He attacked with purpose. Every strike was precise. Every mission was a message. His symbol, a single white feather left at the scene, a tribute to his mother, the peaceful one they slaughtered. The message was simple. Peace was your warning. I am the consequence. The strike on Varnak 9. One of the biggest turning points came on a prison moon called Varnak 9, named after the same commander who killed Kal's mother. It was a fortress built from dark stone and orbiting ice. Nobody escaped Varnak 9. Nobody even tried. Until Kal came. He landed alone. One stolen drop pod, silent entry, dressed like a Zartok worker. Inside, he moved through the halls with a stolen access chip. He said nothing. He simply walked like he belonged. That was the first rule he had learned from Rogan. Confidence is your first weapon. Use it before your gun. He reached the power core in less than 40 minutes, planted 5 explosives, set a timer. Then he walked to the prisoner wing, hacked the doors, and released every captive, not just humans, but other species crushed by the Empire. The alarms screamed. Guards came running. But it was too late. Kale activated the remote detonator. Boom! The lights went black. The roof cracked open. The prisoners escaped into the snow. From a nearby ridge, Kale watched the explosion tear through the base. Fire lit the ice sky. His breath came out in mist. He smiled. Just a little. Fear in the Empire. The Zartok Command Council was furious. Confused. How does a human boy do this? One general shouted. He has no fleet, no army, no support. Commander Varnak, now older and promoted to warlord, sat silently. His face was colder than the moons he ruled. I killed that boy's mother, he said. That was my mistake. Another general asked, and how do we fix it? Varnak replied, we kill him. He sent bounty hunters, mercenaries, shadow assassins from the black sectors. None came back. Some disappeared. Some were found, with white feathers on their chests. And one returned just to deliver a message, a voice recording from Kal himself. You should have killed me too. Now I carry every voice you silenced. The ghost gains followers. Kale never planned to build a team. But some people find fire and follow its light. First came Tassa, a cybernetic medic who once healed Zartok soldiers until they killed her sister. She found Kal on a burned world, treating wounded villagers with stolen supplies. She joined without asking permission. Then came Bran, a beast warrior from a jungle planet, whose entire tribe had been erased by Empire testing. He said nothing the first week, just followed Kale and killed like a storm when needed. And finally, Rix, a broken egg from a lost ship, half mad, half genius. It patched Kale's comms, hacked alien codes, and sang lullabies while building bombs. Together, they formed a unit. Not a team, not a squad, a force. They didn't fight for money. They fought for wrongs unpunished, for lives stolen, for a mother's voice silenced by fire. The name they gave him. They called him many things. The ghost of Ilaria, the human flame, the feather of wrath. But among the people he saved, the name that stayed was simple, Hopebringer. Because when Kel showed up, fire followed. But sometimes, so did freedom. A message to the galaxy. Kel finally spoke to the galaxy after his 100th mission. A hacked broadcast that reached every screen on every Empire-controlled planet. His face was hidden behind a cracked mask. But his voice was clear. You took peace from me. So now I bring you war. You burned my mother's words. Now I burn your walls. We are not weak. We are not broken. We are watching. Humanity does not kneel. Then the signal cut out. Across 10 systems, the message was replayed again and again. Some called it madness. Others called it the beginning. Kel stood aboard a small ship, staring out the window. Tassa approached him. That message, it started something. Kel didn't look at her. He just nodded. Bran stood sharpening his blade. Rix hummed old Earth songs in the background. They weren't just rebels anymore. They were a storm. And Kel, the one who spoke to fire, had now become its voice. The spark becomes a fire. They called it a rumor. Just another rebel. Just another angry human. Just another story that would burn out in the cold silence of space. But they were wrong. The spark did not die. It spread, and it became a fire. A message written in smoke. On a storm-covered world called Kairos 3, the Zartok held a weapons factory the size of a city. It ran day and night, building the machines that powered their rule. Shock rifles, battle drones, and fear. Kel's team hit it during a thunderstorm. They came from underground tunnels. Tunnels built by slaves years ago, now used to free the very people who built them. Rix jammed the sensors. Tassa planted charges. Bran tore through guards like wind through leaves. Kel walked straight into the command tower with nothing but a knife and a code chip. When the factory exploded, the fire could be seen from orbit. Above the wreckage, someone painted a message in the smoke, a simple human phrase, ancient and deadly. We remember. The fire spreads. News of Kel's attacks reached the outer colonies. On Zentra 6, miners refused to load Empire ships unless they were protected by 5 guards. On Lutha Prime, a group of children carved feathers into the walls of their school. And on the ice moon of Telveron, a lone woman walked into a Zartok office, holding nothing but a recording of Kel's broadcast. She played it, looked the officer in the eyes, and said, "He speaks for us." She was executed within the hour. But that message, it spread faster than any bullet. Enemies watching, allies rising. Inside the Empire's war chamber, Warlord Varnak watched Kel's growing legend with a face of stone. He is just one. A commander hissed. No, Varnak growled. He is the match. The forest is already dry. They sent more assassins, stronger machines, Black Ops teams trained in the art of silence. None of them returned. Kel didn't just kill soldiers now. He broke systems. He shattered belief. But not all attention was hostile. A secret group known as the Spiral Resistance reached out. A network of spies, hackers, ex-military, and diplomats too ashamed to bow. They offered Kel ships, weapons, support. Kel refused. I don't bleed armies, he said. Tassa stepped forward. But you've already started one. The cost of fire. In the shadows of an abandoned freighter, Kel listened to the voices of his team. Rix was humming again, an old lullaby from Earth. Bran sharpened his blade without speaking. He always listened, always remembered. Tassa leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Do you ever stop? She asked. Kel looked up. We're close. To what? She said. Revenge. He didn't answer. She sighed. I joined you because I believed. Because of what they did. But Kale, fire can't tell friend from foe. It burns everything. Kale looked at the old crystal, the one with his mother's voice. You are my hope. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he was just a boy again, in the Garden of Harmony, holding his mother's hand. But that boy was gone. Hope doesn't change tyrants, Kale said softly. Only fire does. The Battle of Ashenport. The next mission was supposed to be small, a raid on a supply route near Ashenport, a mining colony in the asteroid belts. But the Empire was waiting. It was a trap. Kale and his team walked into a battlefield. Drones swarming, towers firing, bounty hunters circling like vultures. It was chaos. Fire, smoke, screaming metal. Bran was hit. He fought through it, shielding Kale with his body. Rix was nearly captured, forcing a self-destruct protocol on his hacked systems. Tassa was cornered by 3 shock troops. Kale fought like a storm. Precise, brutal, angry. They barely escaped with their lives. But the damage was done. The fire had grown too bright. And now, it was out of control. Aftermath. They landed on a dead moon with no name. Just to breathe. Just to stop the bleeding. Bran had a cracked rib. Rix's systems were fried. Tassa stitched her own shoulder in silence. Kale stood outside, looking at the stars. Tassa came beside him. We almost died. I know. She touched the feather on his belt. We're not gods, Kale. We can't burn forever. Kale didn't answer at first. Then he said, My mother believed in peace. They killed her for it. I believed in silence. They hunted me anyway. So now, I believe in fire. Tassa's voice broke. And what if fire burns you too? Kale looked at her with eyes that had forgotten childhood. Then let it. The spark becomes a fire. Somewhere in the Empire's core systems, a child heard Kale's story and painted a feather on her wall. A worker in a factory sabotaged a machine and whispered, For Illyria. A pilot in the Empire's navy hesitated before pressing the bomb switch and walked away. One man. One story. One spark. And now, galaxies were watching. Kale sat in his ship, armor cracked, eyes hollow, spirit alive. Rix's voice came through the comms. Signal intercepted. Something big. Empire fleet. Moving toward Thronex. Kale straightened. Thronex. The throne world. The Empire's heart. Tassa entered. If we go there, we might not come back. Kale stood slowly. We're not going to come back, he said. We're going to end it. The spark becomes a fire. Kale had become a name whispered in fear and hope. His attacks were no longer isolated events. They had become sparks, each one igniting something bigger, something he could no longer control. A symbol of resistance, it started on a small mining moon called Varkas V. The people there had lived under Zartok occupation for decades, their labor fueling the Empire's war machines. When Kel's team hit a weapons transport station, it wasn't just about supplies. It was about sending a message. They struck fast and quiet. Tassa handled the tech locks while Rix shut down communications. Bran took down guards like a shadow, his claws silent and deadly. Kale moved through the chaos, leaving his mark. A single white feather as he set the charges. When the facility erupted in flames, the workers didn't just cheer. They rose up. Miners refused to report for duty. They sabotaged equipment. They painted feathers on their helmets, their walls, their tools. They were still outnumbered, still outgunned, but they had something they hadn't felt in years. They had fire. Echoes across the stars. The spark jumped from system to system. On the planet Darvinus, a trader ship intercepted Cal's broadcast and played it across the market square. Zartok soldiers tried to shut it down, but by then it was too late. The words were seared into memory. You burned my world. You silenced my mother. I will not kneel. I will not forget. The galaxy is watching now. And we remember. On Alora's belt, cargo workers began striking. On Nera 3, entire neighborhoods went dark as civilians disrupted the power grid. Kale had never asked for an army. He never sought a following. But his legend carried weight. People who had never known him began fighting in his name. They called him the Feather of Wrath, the Ghost of Ilaria, the Hopebringer. And though Kale still fought alone, the galaxy now saw his battles as more than just revenge, a costly victory. The rebellion wasn't without losses. On the moon Krithia, Kale led a mission to free captured rebels from a heavily fortified Zartok outpost. The team had planned every detail, every escape route, but the Empire had adapted. Bran took a direct hit, his armor cracking under the force. He kept moving, shielding Kale and Tassa as they planted explosives. Rix overloaded his systems to hack the prison locks, his mechanical voice glitching as he sang a lullaby from Earth. The prisoners escaped, but the cost was steep. Tassa found herself cornered, a blaster wound in her side. "We don't have time," she muttered, forcing herself to stand. Cal reached out to steady her, his jaw clenched. "We'll make it," he said, more to himself than to her. When they finally got back to the ship, the mood was grim. Bran's injuries were severe. Rix was barely functional. Tassa leaned against the wall, her face pale, while Kale stared out at the stars. Tassa's warning. "You can't keep doing this," Tassa said one night, her voice low but firm. "You're not just one man anymore. You have people who believe in you, people who will die for you." Kale didn't look at her. His gaze stayed fixed on the galaxy outside. "They're not following me," he said. "They're fighting for what the Empire took from them." Tassa stepped closer. "Maybe. But you lit the match. You're not just avenging your mother anymore. This is bigger than that." Kale closed his eyes. For a moment, he was back in the Garden of Harmony, his mother's voice gentle and unwavering. But that moment was gone, replaced by the weight of all he'd done. "I didn't ask to lead," he finally said. "I just wanted them to pay." Tassa's voice softened. "And now they're paying. But Kale, if you're not careful, you'll burn too." A name that terrified the Empire. In the Zartok war chambers, Kal's name was spoken with cold rage. "He's just one human," a general growled. "How is he doing this?" Warlord Varnek, now older but no less cruel, sat at the head of the table. His metal-clad hands rested on the armrests of his throne-like chair. "He's not one man anymore," Varnak said, his voice icy. "He's a symbol, and symbols are harder to kill." "Then what do we do?" another general asked. Varnak leaned forward. His red eyes burned. "We turn the fire back on him." A fire that could not be stopped. Kal's team continued their strikes, but the missions grew more dangerous. The Empire adapted. They set traps, deployed new weapons, increased patrols. Yet for every countermeasure, Kale found a way through. His growing network of sympathizers fed him information. The spiral resistance offered resources he reluctantly accepted. But as the rebellion grew, so did its costs. Villages caught in crossfire. Sabotaged ships lost in space. Civilians who carried his symbol punished in ways Kale couldn't stop. One night, after a particularly brutal mission, Kale sat alone in the ship's cargo hold. He pulled out the small crystal he had carried all these years, the recording of his mother's last speech. He hadn't played it in months. "Peace is not weakness. Peace is a choice." He turned it off before it finished. "Peace is gone," he muttered. "Now there's only fire." A galaxy on the brink. By the end of the year, the Zartok Empire was bleeding. Supply chains were in chaos. Entire sectors were on high alert, and Kel's name was spoken not just in the outer rings, but in the Empire's core systems. Children in occupied schools scratched feathers into their desks. Workers sabotaged factories, leaving white marks on walls. Pilots hesitated before firing on unarmed transports, whispering, "For Cal." The fire was no longer just Cal's. It had spread across the stars, igniting hope, fear, and rebellion. The Empire, once untouchable, now felt the heat, and Kale knew it was only a matter of time before the Zartok brought everything they had to stop him. But he wasn't afraid. He had become the fire. And now, the galaxy was burning. The wrath of suns. They thought the fire would burn out. But they didn't understand what fueled it. Kale had no home to return to, no family to protect, no quiet future to hope for. His life was the fire now, and it was only growing. The plan. The Empire's strongest prison, Threx's Hold, was built on a planet with no sunlight. The skies were perpetually gray, the ground blackened and barren. Zartok guards patrolled every sector, their movements precise and cold. This was where the rebellion's leaders, humans, alien allies, anyone who had dared speak against the Zartok, were held, behind unbreakable walls, beneath layers of electronic security, in cells that silenced their voices. It was also where Kale was headed. The plan was audacious, a small team infiltrating a fortress meant to repel entire fleets. But Kale had never relied on numbers. He relied on precision, on fear, on the one thing the Empire couldn't anticipate. Him. The approach. Kale's ship was cloaked, gliding silently through the atmosphere. Beside him, Bran checked his weapons, his claws clicking against metal. Tassa was bandaging her arm, the last wound from their previous mission barely healed. Rix hummed a static-filled tune, running through the dozens of scripts and bypasses needed to crack the prison's defenses. Kale spoke quietly. Everyone knows their role. We go in, get them out, and get clear before reinforcements arrive. No mistakes. Bran grunted. Tassa gave a curt nod. Rix just hummed louder, his mechanical voice glitching as he said, "Mistakes are for machines, and I'm too broken to make them." Kal's gaze stayed on the planet below. Let's begin. The infiltration. They landed outside the main compound, deep in the shadow of a jagged cliff. The only way in was through the ventilation system, which Rix had already mapped out using stolen Zartok schematics. Kale led the way, his movements silent, his team following close behind. Tassa placed silent charges at key junctions, ready to blow escape routes if needed. Bran carried a heavy plasma cutter, his bulk making it look lighter than it was. Rix worked quickly, his robotic fingers dancing across a portable console, disabling cameras and rerouting security bots. Inside, the halls were cold, lifeless. Zartok guards walked their patrols, unaware that shadows were moving just beyond their vision. Kale signaled. Tassa slipped forward, her blade glinting for just a moment before a guard dropped. Bran handled the next one, his claws sinking into armor silently. They reached the main cell block without raising a single alarm. It was almost too easy. Kale felt the weight of it. A trap, perhaps, or the calm before the storm. But they had come too far to stop now. The breakout. The cell doors opened all at once. Dozens of prisoners, gaunt, pale, beaten, stepped out into the dim light. Some looked at Kale and his team with hope, others with caution. But when Kale raised a single white feather, their faces changed. One of the older prisoners, a human woman with a scar running down her cheek, stepped forward. "You're him," she whispered. "The one they call the Feather of Wrath." Kale didn't respond. He just nodded once. "We're getting you out." But before they could move, the alarms began. Rix's voice came through Kale's comm. We've got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Kale asked. "The loud, shooty kind." The next thing Kale heard was the sound of boots, metal clanging against the floors. Then came the drones, hovering, armed, and deadly. The fight. It wasn't chaos. It was a calculated storm. Bran charged forward, taking the brunt of the initial attack. His plasma cutter carved through drones like paper, his roars echoing down the corridors. Tassa stayed close to the prisoners, laying down cover fire with a steady hand, her movements precise despite her injuries. Kale moved like a shadow. He fired only when needed, his shots clean and deliberate. When a guard came too close, his blade flashed, and the threat was gone. But the Zartok weren't unprepared. More reinforcements poured in. Heavy units, equipped with shields and advanced weaponry, pressed the team back toward the cell block. Rix shouted through the comms, "I can open another route, but it's gonna cost us time." "We don't have time," Tassa snapped. Kale made the call. "Do it." The cost. The prisoners ran, following Bran and Tassa down the new route Rix had opened. But the delay meant more Zartok forces closed in. Kale stayed behind, covering their retreat. He moved through the halls, planting charges at key points. When the enemies pushed forward, the explosions stopped them cold. But each blast slowed Kal's pace, his margin for escape growing thinner. Tassa's voice came over the comm. "Kale, where are you?" "Just clearing the way," he replied, his voice calm. "Get out of there." Kale didn't answer. The Wrath of Suns. In the final stretch, Kale found himself face to face with a Zartok commander. The alien's armor was black as night, his red eyes burning with hate. "You should have stayed in the shadows, human," the commander said. "Your rebellion ends here." Kale didn't respond with words. He lunged, his blade meeting the alien's weapon in a clash of sparks. The fight was brutal, every strike a test of strength and skill. Kale fought not as a soldier, but as a son who carried the weight of 1,000 voices silenced by fire. In the end, Kal's blade found its mark. The commander fell, his body hitting the floor with a final thud. Kale staggered back, breathing hard. Blood dripped from a gash on his side. But he didn't stop. He kept moving, kept fighting, until he reached the evac point. Aftermath. The prisoners were free. The team was alive. Bruised, battered, but alive. Bran sat slumped against the wall of the ship, his massive chest rising and falling like a bellows. Tassa was tending to her own wounds, her eyes flicking to Kale every few moments. Rix's voice crackled as he tried to repair his damaged systems, muttering something about next time needing a bigger distraction. Kale sat apart from them, staring at the single feather he still carried. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You are my hope, Kale, not my weapon." He closed his fist around the feather, his jaw tight. He had brought hope today, but it hadn't come without cost. Each battle left its mark, not just on his body, but on his soul. A galaxy watching. Across the galaxy, people whispered about the prison break. They spoke of the Feather of Wrath, the human who defied the Zartok and freed their prisoners. But Kale didn't see it as a victory. To him, it was just another step, another scar, another reminder that the fire he had started was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who believed in something more. And it was far from over. The fall of gods. Thronex wasn't just a planet. It was a monument, a city world of blackened steel and crimson skies, built to remind the galaxy who held power. Every tower reached into the clouds. Every wall glowed with energy fields that could repel entire fleets. This was the center of the Zartok Empire, the unshakable core, the seat of their god-emperor. And Kale was coming for it. The plan. The resistance had grown, but even with hundreds of new fighters and dozens of stolen ships, a direct assault on Thronex was suicide. Instead, Kale chose precision. A small strike team would infiltrate the Imperial Palace, while the larger rebel fleet caused a distraction in the outer system. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but Kale knew one thing. The Empire's strength lay in its head. Cut it off, and the body would fall. Kale gathered his team in the dimly lit cargo hold of their ship. Tassa, her arms still wrapped from the last mission, stood with her rifle slung across her back. Bran leaned against the wall, silent as always, his claws glinting in the faint light. Rix's voice crackled as he hummed an old Earth tune, his damaged circuits sparking occasionally. "This is it," Kale said, his voice steady but heavy. "We get in, we end this, and we get out. If we fail." He stopped, then corrected himself. "We won't fail." Tassa gave him a sharp look. "If we do, what happens to the rebellion?" Cal's eyes met hers. "It doesn't end. But it will have to find another leader." The approach. Thronex's orbit was a fortress. Orbital defense platforms, battleship patrols, and drones swarmed the skies. The rebel fleet appeared at the system's edge, drawing immediate attention. Zartok warships turned to face them, leaving a gap in the planet's defenses. Cal's ship slipped through that gap. They landed in the lower levels of the palace's industrial sector. The air was thick with smog and the hum of massive machinery. This was where the Empire's greatest weapons were forged, where the energy that powered the throne itself was generated. Cal and his team moved quickly. Tassa disabled surveillance drones. Bran tore through automated turrets, and Rix hacked the energy grid to mask their movements. As they ascended through maintenance shafts and forgotten service tunnels, Cal felt the weight of the place. Every step brought them closer to the center of power, and closer to death. The Hall of Shadows. The palace's upper levels were a labyrinth of darkened corridors and massive halls lined with obsidian pillars. The air was colder here, the silence oppressive. Rix whispered through the comms, "We've tripped something. Movement ahead." The team halted, weapons ready. From the shadows emerged the squad of elite Zartok guards, their armor gleaming, their weapons unlike anything Cal had seen before. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the Emperor's personal guard, known as the Black Flame. Bran moved first, his plasma cutter slicing through the air. The battle was fast and brutal. Tassa's shots found weak points in the guard's armor, while Rix used his last functioning drone to confuse their targeting systems. Cal fought like a man possessed. His blade moved with precision, his strikes relentless. One guard lunged at him, and Cal parried, his blade cutting deep into the alien's side. Another swung a heavy plasma axe, and Cal ducked, countering with a shot to the exposed joint. The Black Flame fell one by one, but not without cost. Bran took a hit to his side, his movements slowing. Tassa's armor was scorched, her breathing heavy. Rix's voice crackled as his systems began to fail. When the last guard dropped, Cal stood in the silence, blood dripping from his blade. "Move," he said. "We're running out of time." The throne room. They reached the final chamber, a vast circular hall with a ceiling that seemed to stretch into infinity. The throne stood at its center, a massive structure of black metal and glowing red runes, and sitting upon it was the Emperor. He was larger than any Zartok Cal had ever seen, his armor a fusion of machine and flesh. His eyes burned with the light of a dying star. His voice echoed as he spoke. "You dare bring your rebellion to my sanctum." Cal stepped forward. "You killed my mother." The Emperor tilted his head, as if searching his memory. "Ah, the boy who fled. The child who thought he could defy a god." Cal's grip tightened on his blade. "You're no god." The Emperor rose, his massive frame casting a shadow over the room. "You have come far, human, but it ends here." The final battle. The fight was nothing like Cal had faced before. The Emperor moved with unnatural speed, his strikes powerful enough to shatter the floor beneath their feet. His voice carried an otherworldly power, shaking Cal to his core. Tassa fired shot after shot, but the Emperor's armor absorbed the blasts. Bran charged, his claws raking against the metallic plating, only to be thrown back with a single blow. Rix tried to disrupt the Emperor's systems, but his weakened circuits failed. Cal fought with everything he had. He dodged the Emperor's crushing blows, countering with strikes aimed at exposed joints. Each hit seemed insignificant against the overwhelming presence before him. But Cal didn't stop. He couldn't. "You think you can kill me?" The Emperor roared. "I am eternal." Cal's voice was steady. "You're just another tyrant." He saw an opening, an exposed seam in the Emperor's armor, just above the left shoulder. With a final surge of strength, Kale lunged. His blade pierced through the seam, driving deep into the Emperor's core. The Emperor staggered, his eyes flickering. "You will never win." Kale twisted the blade, and the Emperor fell. A world without a throne. The silence that followed was deafening. Kale stood over the Emperor's body, his chest heaving. Tassa and Bran moved to his side, bruised and bleeding but alive. Rix's voice crackled faintly, barely audible. The throne room's lights dimmed. The rooms faded. The air grew still. Kale turned to his team. "It's done." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew the battle was far from over. The Emperor's death would send shockwaves through the Empire. The fire that Kale had started would spread further than ever. And with the Emperor gone, the galaxy would look to him for answers, for guidance, for hope.